So for this part of the course, we are going to review IELTS Speaking Part 1. So this is an introduction to the Part 1 of the IELTS Speaking exam. We're going to talk about the introduction section of Part 1. We are also going to talk about some questions about studying or working. We're going to go over some example exam questions. Those two example exam questions have to do with weekends and traveling. And then we'll cover some common Part 1 topics and also talk about Part 1 subtopics. So let's start with the introduction. So there are two different sections to Part 1. The first section we're going to call the introduction. The first section of Part 1, the examiner will introduce themselves and ask some basic questions about you and your work or study. These first couple of questions are always the same for any test taker. So the examiner will always ask you, "My name is Dustin Staats. What is your full name? What can I call you? Where are you from? Can you show me your ID, please? What do you do? Do you work or are you a student?" So we click on ID. ID is short for identification. So identification may be used instead of ID. So this is an image to prove who you are. For example, your passport or your country's ID. The examiner will ask for your identification during the test so they know it is you. So now let's go over Part 1, studying or working. So the examiner will ask you, do you work or are you a student? And based on your response, the examiner might ask you some questions. So if you work, they will ask you, where do you work? Or what do you do? Or why did you choose this profession? Or what would you like to do in the future? If you are a student, the examiner will ask, what do you study? Or where do you study? Or tell me about your school? Or why did you choose this topic, subject, or area? And finally, they may ask, what do you plan or hope to do when you complete your studies? So let's go over some example exam questions. So after the introductory questions for Part 1, the examiner will ask you questions based on a topic. So the examiner may ask you about 2 or 3 different topics. So let's look over some of the topics the examiner may ask. So the examiner might ask about the topic weekends. So the examiner will usually use a transitional phrase to start to talk about a new topic. Like, I'd like to talk about weekends. And then they will ask you a question. Are weekends important to you? So you should respond with about 3 or 4 sentences in length. It's better to say more than less for Part 1. They might ask you, what do you usually do on the weekends? Or what do you think about taking breaks? So the examiner will ask you about 3 to 4 questions based on the topic. So the examiner again will use a transitional phrase. So let's move on. I'd like to talk about traveling. Do you like to travel? Why do you think people travel? Would you rather visit family and friends when traveling or explore someplace else? Is it important that your job or school gives you time off to travel? Again, the examiner may ask you 3 or 4 different questions. Be sure to answer with about 4 to 6 sentences. Again, it's better to say more than less. Okay, so let's look at some other common Part 1 topics. So we have a big list here. They can include any of these topics for Part 1 and even more. But here are some common ones. Now think about some questions that could be asked for these topics. So if we look at the topic weather, the examiner may ask you, what is your favorite type of weather? Or what is the weather like in your home country? Then maybe if we look at cooking, the examiner may ask you, do you know how to cook any dishes? Or what kind of dishes are popular to cook in your home country? So you should always think about these topics and how they relate to you or how they relate to your home country. Okay, so now Part 1 also has some subtopics. For example, the topic food. So types of food, like what is your favorite food or what are some healthy foods? Or food preparation, like do you know how to cook or what is your favorite meal? Then we can look at accommodation. These can have 2 different topics as well. Like the place you live, so what is your living situation like? Or do you have a lot of convenient things in your home? Or during travel, where do you like to stay when you travel? Or what are some different types of accommodation for traveling? So that's it for the introduction to IELTS Speaking Part 1. So continue with this course by going on to the next lesson.